Wow. Hey.
All right, what's up? All right, what do you got for me? Fairly quick, because I don't want to, or just not.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I'll try to be really quickly. Um, so one of the big issues that I'm having with what Lauren is saying is that she keeps bringing up this total population Swedish study
hmm
by the Brandstorm and I don't know how to pronounce their disgusting Swedish names. Um, but anyways, so the basic thing with that study is are you aware of like the general difference between a longitudinal and a cross-sectional study?
My idea is that like my idea is that a longitudinal study will take some cohort and it will like follow them from like an early point in their life to some other later point, and then you like measure the difference versus them in a control group or something.
Yeah, so the original study was like strictly longitudinal and it didn't have a control group, right? And so
I
the
don't
authors
understand
were
I
basically
don't know what that means because I don't know how you have a longitudinal study without a control group, or what are you comparing it to?
sure. So basically, what the authors did is they were trying to examine the effect of like years since hormone treatment initiation and years since last gender affirming surgery on
hmm
the likelihood of having received a mood or anxiety disorder treatment in a given year, right?
Okay.
So they were trying to see like we're going to examine like a certain group of people and we're going to try and see whether or not the amount of years since they received hormone treatment is related to the likelihood of them receiving some sort of mental health treatment in 2015. And the idea, of course, is that if you're receiving mental health treatment, that's probably like a
An indicator
proxy for
of
like,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, and so the correction that she cited was people were mad because they were like, okay, well, we want a control group in this study. And so what the authors did was then they added in a control group because so then they said, okay, so we're not just going to analyze one group, we're going to analyze a group of trans people or people who were diagnosed with, at the time, the diagnosis was gender incongruence disorder. And we're going to compare it with a group of trans people. We're going to compare a group of trans people who did transition and compare their likelihood of having mental health treatment with a control group of trans people who didn't transition. And basically, what they found is when you reanalyze the data with that control group in mind, what you see is that she's correct, right? Like when you reanalyze the data with that control group, there isn't a positive effect of transitioning on trans people's well-being.
hmm
Um, but the problem with that is that when you're using a control group, so back when back in the time when the data was being collected, the diagnosis wasn't gender dysphoria; it was gender incongruence disorder. And unlike gender dysphoria, which gender dysphoria is very specifically like looking at people whose gender identity causes like a significant degree of psychological harm for them,
hmm
right? Um, Whereas gender incongruence disorder, it wasn't specifically looking at that. It was just looking more generally at people whose like gender expression didn't match their sex, even if they didn't experience their gender as significantly harmful.
hmm
And so when you make a control group of people who are diagnosed with gender incongruence disorder, and specifically you're looking at people who didn't seek treatment, it's inevitable that control group is going to end up seeming more mentally healthy because that control group is going to consist of all of the trans people whose gender wasn't stressful enough for them in the first place for them to even need to go and seek treatment. And so, like, the data is kind of skewed in that direction for that reason. Um, and so like we can talk about like whether or not the original um, longitudinal approach was like a good approach, but it seems pretty clear to me that like the inclusion of the control group makes the study like significantly worse. And the authors of the original study um, even like went made sure to like include this fact and like explain why this control group is like a bad way to analyze the data when they added it. They were more so just adding the control group to say like people criticized our study because we didn't add this, and so we're just going to add it for the sake of pleasing people, but also like made sure to explain why it was like the problems with using that control group.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that was like the main thing. I think fuck, there's like some other issues. I guess okay, so one of the things that you kind of touched on that was I thought that you made a good point in this regard, and I guess I just kind of wanted to say that this is like very empirically substantiated, which is that when Lauren brings up, and roughly when anybody, basically whenever anybody brings up the point that like, you know, most trans people don't end up not being trans, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
they stop being trans. Um, Basically, the problem here is that you're not looking specifically at people who have gender dysphoria. You're just looking at people who are more broadly sort of gender expansive. And one thing, I read this interesting paper from, I think it's from like the Human Rights Campaign and the American Academy of Osteopathic Pediatricians. And the point that they basically make there is that if you look at like analyses of these kinds of people, competent clinicians generally can tell differences between kids who are just like broadly gender expansive and kids who actually have gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
Like these two different groups of people tend to answer questions like very differently on surveys. So like one thing is that like gender expansive people all often say that they wish they were the other gender, whereas people with gender dysphoria tend to answer the same question by saying they feel that they actually are like the other gender.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so like there's a variety of different ways in which these two different groups of people like will answer questions on surveys and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so like competent clinicians generally can disaggregate people who are likely to continue being trans throughout their lives and people who are likely to not. And this is why there was a study that I remember it made the rounds in like right wing YouTube. Stephen Crowder brought it up, John Doyle brought it up, where it is basically like you put kids on puberty blockers, and every single one of the kids who went on puberty blockers continued and went on to take cross sex hormones, and John Doyle and Stephen Crowder basically were like, hey, this means that puberty blockers are making kids become trans because we know otherwise they would have likely not became trans.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually read this study, the authors of the study say pretty specifically that the reason that the sample group went on to be trans and there wasn't a single desister was because we know that if we carefully diagnose people, we are able to disaggregate this and select specifically for people who aren't likely to desist. So it's like, I guess, another big issue I had.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I mean, there was other stuff, but I don't want to keep you for too long. I
Is
think
it?
those were the main points.
So I have to, if I'm gonna start digging into these issues, I got to start like going through all these fucking studies again. Is it? My understanding is that because the last time I did a lot of reading, and this was when Ben Shapiro was bringing up shit. My understanding is that as of right now, stuff like HRT and SRS are like pretty widely associated with having positive outcomes for trans people. That like that's just like not really a very contentious thing to say anymore. Is that true, or do you think that's not necessarily the case?
So that
At least
is
for adults. I don't know
basically,
about children, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, that is basically true. So one of the things that Lauren Southern brought up, and she kind of just says like, look, there's no like perfect studies on this issue,
Mm-hmm.
which is true. There is no perfect studies, and of course, there's never going to be a perfect study on anything.
Mm-hmm.
But there's particular impediments when we're talking about studying like issues for trans people. So like specifically in the medical field, the sort of the like the gold standard for studies is a double blind controlled study. And the idea there is that like you give one group a treatment, you give another group a placebo, like a control group, you see like the differing outcomes for these different groups.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is like obviously when it comes to transitioning, there's no placebo for transitioning, right? Like you know whether or not you have a dick. It's pretty
Mm-hmm.
apparent.
Or even if
And
you're on
so
HRT, you'll know, right?
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there can't really be any placebo, and there can't really be like so like having a proper control group would require that we take a group of properly diagnosed trans people who meet the requirements for gender reassignment operations, and then randomly split the participants into two groups and have one group which receives treatment and one of which doesn't, to like compare the outcomes. But the problem with that obviously is that withholding treatment from the latter group would be highly unethical and
Mm-hmm.
would never be approved to run a study like that. Um, so you can't do an ideal study, like the best kinds of studies that we can do, you just can't do it with transitioning.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the studies which we have to rely on, they mostly incorporate something approximating like three different basic types of methodologies. So like one, you can just measure the quality of life of a trans person before and after transitioning. Two, you can measure the quality of life of a sample of trans people after surgery or after transitioning and compare it to the average quality of life for trans people before surgery. And three, you can just simply ask trans people if they feel better after surgery than they did before.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are the three basic like methodologies that we can apply. And again, like they're not perfect, but basically what we've seen is like there have been there's several meta-analyses. I can cite the Cornell one that Hunter cited, or not Hunter. Wait, was it? Yeah, Hunter. The Cornell one that Hunter cited wasn't that great, but we have a bunch of meta-analyses and a bunch of studies that basically utilize those three methodologies, and pretty unanimously, they come out with positive results. I've yet to see like a substantial number of like quality studies which would I guess go against this consensus. So it seems like the data is imperfect, but based on what we have to work with, it's like it all pretty much goes in the same direction, which is that transitioning is like generally beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I guess one final thing. This will be really quick.
Mm-hmm.
This one I'm not totally sure on because I'm not like constantly reading like my like research and shit. But she made this point about how the suicide rate among trans people who report no social discrimination was at 25%, and I'm about 90 to 95% sure that she was citing a specific UCLA survey about that.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that the UCLA survey didn't actually it's not actually analyzing, or it doesn't actually take into account whether or not the suicide attempts took place before or after they like experienced that experience, right? So like let's say for example like if I like experienced discrimination, right? And then I attempted suicide, right? Or you could do the same thing with transitioning, because people try to say the same thing with transitioning statistics, where they'll say like this many people who transitioned still committed suicide, but the suicide attempts were often before the transitioning. And so I think that's like something you kind of have to be careful with that survey in particular, is you're not
Yeah,
really,
I think
yeah.
that might have been the one. That might have been the Ben Shapiro one. I need to go and read this
Yeah, I
after,
think,
but
yeah.
yeah, because and then the idea is that of course if these people were transitioning, they were already like the most like at risk people anyway. Like this makes
Yeah,
sense. That,
exactly.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The other one that so I think Ben Shapiro cites two, if I remember. I think he cites the UCLA one. He also cites the Swedish one that you were talking about, where like the author, yeah, came out in a Reddit thing and was like,
I don't
yeah,
know
like
why
this
conservatives
isn't.
keep citing my study
Yeah,
incorrectly. It
yeah,
pisses me off.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the big issue with that study is, and not only did the author say that, but the author literally went on to co-author a meta-analysis about how transitioning is actually helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But additionally, the problem with that study is that they basically use they use a cis control group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like they're not comparing the suicide rate of post-op trans people to pre-op trans people. They're comparing the suicide rate of post-op trans people to cis people,
Which is still
which
probably
is
going to
like,
be higher. We'd expect it to be higher, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if it was lower, like at that point, then maybe it would be good for like normal cis people or whatever to start transitioning. If it actually would,
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it wouldn't make any sense. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Exactly.
I noticed that when we just had our conversation, she's like, oh, like people that transition still have a 25% suicide. It's like, okay, but that might be higher than the norm. But the question is if it's higher than the control group, which shouldn't be
Yeah.
the norm, it should be
Exactly. Yeah.
other trans people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you have to take into account, like, even if, like, I don't think anybody is saying that if you're a trans person and you transition, I'm sure some people are saying it, but like, not many people are saying that if you're a trans person and you transition, then all of a sudden you don't have any more problems, right? I mean, you might still have issues where like your family doesn't accept you for being trans, or like your peers, or like you lost friendships for being trans, or you might still have some sort of like psychological issues because you don't fully accept yourself because there's a lot of like transphobic norms in society. So it's like, I mean, of course there are a variety of issues that trans people face where it's like transitioning isn't going to solve everything, but that's not how we evaluate the effectiveness of medical like treatments. Like, you don't say, like, if we're evaluating how effective a medical treatment is, we don't say like, does this fix all of your issues? We just say like, okay, does this seem to help, right? Does this
Yeah.
seem to like reduce certain symptoms? And in this case it seems that transitioning does.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anything else? Do you have any hot takes for us on Israel Palestine?
I'm gonna be honest, like I just started like reading into it. I like a good omniliberal DGGer, I've primarily just been fucking reading Wikipedia articles. But basically, like, from my current understanding is, because I guess I'm super duper cynic pilled and like fucking black pilled on like the state of online discourse and the online left. And I know that like a lot of online lefties go really hard on like this, fuck Israel's a genocidal state and shit. So I guess I was like expecting there to be some degree of like moral complexity here, but it seems kind of like, from what everything that I've read, this seems like a pretty clear cut example of like the settlement's pretty fucked up and like shouldn't be happening.
What shouldn't be happening? Israeli people settling into the West Bank?
Yeah, like the military occupation of like Palestinian land.
Well,
Or like
I mean so the
they,
contentious part is that term, right? Is it Palestinian
yeah.
land? Because Israel occupies it as they have for some 70 years or however long. But that occupation just hasn't been internationally recognized, and that is the primary contention is
Yeah,
whose land
yeah.
is it? Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that Israel went into like Israel was given a certain amount of land in Palestine by the UN after World War II, and at some point down the line, there was a 5-day war between Israel and I think it was Egypt and maybe like Jordan,
Egypt,
and
Jordan, and
Syria.
Syria. I think it was a
Yeah,
6-day war, but yeah.
yeah, something like that. And it was like a very short war between like Israel and these other nations. And then like in the course of that war, Israel came to just sort of start occupying land that was previously designated to Palestinians. And then kind of like even after the war was over, they just kind of stayed and have since committed, I think, probably like numerous human rights abuses that have been like recognized by the UN. But of course you have to be skeptical of that because it's like, I mean, UN is to some extent, I'm a foreign policy realist. I think the UN is made up of self-interested state actors, but yeah, it seems like there's pretty clear evidence that like Israel's done some pretty fucked up shit.
Yeah, I think I guess the main contention is who should own the lands, I guess. Yeah, and then it's rough when you're Jewish because there's a lot of people in that part of the world that don't like you a lot, and And there's a lot
Yeah.
of vested interest from other countries in Palestine being strong and powerful, that a lot of that plays directly into kind of like anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli sentiments. So yeah, I don't know. That situation
Yeah.
is a clusterfuck. I don't know. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
In terms of there are just so many other people that have their hands in it. I don't know what the right answer is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really complicated. I remember, I know that's like a meme to say, but I thought it was kind of funny. Like earlier on Twitter, I posted something like I posted something basically expressing the sentiment I expressed earlier, where it's like I expected my takeaway to be a lot more like morally gray than it turned out to be, where it seemed like more clear cut than I was expecting. And I like posted that on Twitter, and then like all of a sudden I'm seeing all of these people retweet it, and I'm like, who's retweeting this? And I see these people with like fucking Hamas stan in their bio, and I'm like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very rough discourse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what are you gonna do? All right. Well,
Skrill, I guess.
just grill. Yeah. All right. Well, hey, have fun. Be careful. Stay safe.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for bringing me on.
Yeah, no problem. Have fun. Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed. I think that's a good staff for you there too.
Oh, you.
Epic, dude.